shocking truth. Who was the first Adam or Eve? You've heard the story 1,000 times. God makes Adam, then pops out one of his ribs to make Eve. Simple, right? But what if I told you that's only half the story? The Bible itself gives us a second, totally different creation account, where man and woman show up at the exact same time. So what's the real story? Who was actually first, Adam or Eve? The answer is way more complicated and a lot more interesting than you might think. For centuries, anyone opening the book of Genesis has been met with a puzzle on the first 2 pages. It seems to tell the creation story twice, and the 2 versions just don't line up. This isn't some wild new theory. It's a well-known feature of the text that has sparked debate for thousands of years. So let's lay out the problem. In Genesis chapter 1, we get this grand cosmic view. Over 6 perfectly structured days, God, who is called by the Hebrew title Elohim, speaks the entire universe into existence. First light, then sky, then land and plants, sun and moon, sea creatures, birds, and finally land animals. Then, at the very end of day 6 is the absolute pinnacle of creation. God makes humankind. The text says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." The clear takeaway here is that they were made together at the same time after everything else was already in place. But then you flip the page to Genesis chapter 2 and the story seems to hit the reset button, but with a different vibe and a totally different sequence. The style is much more personal and down to earth. God is now called Yahweh, Elohim, or Lord God. And the order of creation gets flipped on its head. In this version, God first forms a man, Adam, from the dust of the earth before a single shrub or plant has even grown. Then, after putting Adam in the Garden of Eden, God decides it's not good for the man to be alone. So he forms the animals and the birds and brings them to Adam to be named. When none of them are the right fit, God puts Adam into a deep sleep, takes something from his side, and from that fashions a woman, Eve. So yeah, you can see the problem. Genesis 1 says plants, then animals, then man and woman together. Genesis 2 says man, then garden plants, then animals, and finally woman. Who came first? Does the Bible give 2 different answers? Answering this question has launched one of the biggest detective stories in biblical scholarship. To crack this puzzle, we have to think like textual detectives. The leading theory in most mainstream academic circles is called the documentary hypothesis. It sounds complicated, but the core idea is pretty simple. The first 5 books of the Bible weren't written by one person like Moses. Instead, they were skillfully woven together by later editors from several older separate source documents. According to this theory, our 2 creation stories come from 2 of these different sources. The grand, orderly 7-day account in Genesis 1 is believed to come from what scholars call the priestly source, or P. They think it was written down relatively late, maybe around the 6th century BC. This source always uses the formal title Elohim for God and is obsessed with order, structure, and the Sabbath. The second story, the more homespun narrative in Genesis 2, is thought to come from a much older source called the Yahwist or J source because it uses God's personal name, Yahweh. This one might have been written as early as the 10th or 9th century BC. The J source talks about God in very human-like terms. When you see them as two separate stories, the contradictions just disappear. They aren't contradictions at all. The priestly author of Genesis 1 was likely pushing back against other creation myths of the time, like the Babylonian Enuma Elish, where the world is born from violent conflict between gods. Genesis 1 shows a single all-powerful God creating an ordered world with his words alone. The Yahwist author of Genesis 2 had a different mission. He wasn't telling a cosmic story. He was telling a human story about our connection to God, to the land, and to each other. For this author, the order of creation wasn't the point. The relationships were .so in this view. The Bible we have is a masterful work of editing. An ancient redactor took these two cherished but very different traditions and placed them side by side, making sure both perspectives were preserved. Now, that's not the only way to see it. For centuries, long before the documentary hypothesis came along, Jewish and Christian interpreters read these two chapters as one single coherent story. The most popular take is the wide-angle versus zoom lens theory. Proponents say Genesis 1 is the wide-angle shot. It's a broad chronological summary of the entire creation week showing the big picture. Genesis 2 then isn't a second creation story, but a zoom lens. It's drilling down into the events of day 6, giving us a detailed close-up look at how the first man and woman were actually created and placed in the Garden of Eden. But what about that conflicting order? Harmonizers have answers for that too. For the plants, they point out that Genesis 1 is talking about global vegetation on day 3. Genesis 2 verse 5, they argue, is talking about a specific type of plant, cultivated crops that need a farmer. The animal issue is often explained by taking a closer look at the Hebrew grammar. While some English translations of Genesis 2 verse 19 make it sound like the animals were created right there after Adam, many scholars argue the Hebrew verb can be translated as the past perfect tense. Finally, the creation of man and woman is seen as a simple case of summary followed by the juicy details. Genesis 1 states the fact, God made them male and female. Genesis 2 gives the narrative play-by-play. Adam was formed first, and then Eve was formed from him to be his perfect partner. So we have two very different but compelling cases. On one side, the academic view says two separate stories were stitched together. On the other, the traditional view argues it's one story told from two angles. Which one is it? While the harmonization approach offers some clever and elegant solutions, it can rely on very specific and sometimes debated readings of Hebrew words and grammar. For example, the whole debate over whether Eve was made from a rib or, as the Hebrew word more often means, a side, shows how much can hang on a single word. However, the evidence for two distinct sources is pretty powerful. The different names for God, the completely different writing styles, the sequence of events, and the core message of each chapter are hard to just explain away. Most biblical scholars today feel that the documentary hypothesis best explains why the text looks the way it does. So to finally answer our question, who was first, Adam or Eve? The Bible gives two answers because it tells two stories. According to the older story in Genesis 2, Adam was first, no question. But according to the later story in Genesis 1, they were created together as God's final crowning act. The shocking truth isn't that one is right and the other is wrong. The shocking truth is that the final editors of Genesis believed both stories were essential. Look, this isn't just some dusty old literary puzzle. It's a fascinating window into how the Bible was actually put together and how we can read it today. Realizing there are different voices in the text doesn't weaken it. It makes it richer. It shows us the Bible isn't some flat, one-dimensional rule book that just fell out of the sky. It's a library of diverse texts written over centuries. Understanding that Genesis has two creation narratives lets us appreciate the unique message of each one. One story gives us a God of breathtaking cosmic order who creates a good world and makes humanity its caretakers. The other gives us an intimate, personal God who forms us with his own hands, walks with us in a garden, and understands our deepest need for connection. Both are true. Both are vital. So what do you think? Which explanation makes more sense to you? The idea of two separate sources woven together, or the view that it's one unified story told from different angles? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I really do read them. And if you enjoy exploring the fascinating and often surprising stories inside the Bible, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next investigation.